The evening was full of charm and excitement. The grand hall glowed under golden lights, and people in elegant clothes filled the rows of red velvet seats. A gentle sound of chatter floated through the air, mixed with the sweet scent of roses placed on every table. Everyone was waiting for one man, the famous pianist Leonard Voss. Leonard was known all around the world for his magical fingers and his proud smile. He walked onto the stage with the confidence of a king. His black suit shone under the lights, and when he bowed, the crowd clapped loudly. He gave a small smile, not humble, but proud. He loved the attention, the respect, the feeling that the world was watching only him. The piano stood in the center, shining like a black diamond. Leonard sat down, closed his eyes for a second, and then his fingers touched the keys. Music filled the air like wind through a forest. Soft and strong at the same time, every note danced. Every sound carried emotion. People were enchanted. They looked at him with pure admiration. Some even whispered that he was born for this. But among the hundreds of fancy guests, there sat one woman who did not fit in. Her name was Clara Bennett. She sat quietly near the corner, wearing a simple light blue dress that had been ironed carefully but was clearly old. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her eyes, calm and deep, followed every movement of Leonard's hands. Unlike others, she didn't see fame or perfection. She saw feeling, and she felt something stir inside her. Clara was not from this world of glitter and fame. She worked at a small cafe near the train station. She served tea and cleaned tables, but when she got home at night, she played her old piano. It was scratched. Some keys didn't even work, yet it was her best friend. Her mother used to say that Clara's fingers told stories when they touched the piano, stories about her heart, her hopes, her dreams as Leonard played. Clara felt her heart beating fast. She loved the beauty of his music, but she also sensed something missing. The sound was perfect, and too perfect. Maybe it was like a diamond with no warmth. She thought to herself, he plays like a master, but he doesn't feel like one who has known pain. She did not know why she felt that way, but her heart told her it was true. When the final note faded, the crowd jumped to their feet. The applause was thunderous. Leonard smiled proudly and stood up, taking a long bow. He loved this moment, when people shouted his name, when flowers were thrown at his feet, cameras flashed, and reporters whispered among themselves about his brilliant performance. Clara clapped too. Softly, but her eyes were thoughtful. She had brought something with her, an old notebook full of her own music. It wasn't grand or polished, just songs she had written late at night when no one was listening. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the notebook. She didn't come here to challenge anyone. She only wanted to show her heart. After the concert ended, the guests moved toward the lobby, laughing and taking photos. Leonard walked through the crowd like a celebrity. People surrounded him, asking for autographs and compliments. Clara stood near the exit, unsure if she should go home or take a chance. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her notebook, and whispered to herself, maybe he will listen. Maybe he will understand, as Leonard turned to leave. Clara stepped forward, her voice was soft but steady. Excuse me, Mr. Voss, she said. He looked at her quickly, scanning her from head to toe. She wasn't wearing designer clothes. Her shoes were worn, her hair tied simply. For a moment, he almost didn't respond. But then curiosity or pride made him pause. Yes? He asked, his tone polite but distant. Clara smiled nervously. Your music was wonderful, she said. I've written something of my own. I was hoping you could. Maybe take a look. She held out her notebook. Leonard glanced at it, and the cover was torn. The pages slightly yellowed. A small laugh escaped him. Not cruel at first, just surprised. You wrote music? He asked. Clara nodded. Just simple pieces, she said quietly. Leonard's eyes softened for a second. Then pride returned to his face. My dear, he said with a charming smile. Music like mine takes years of discipline. It's not something you learn by playing at home. His voice carried amusement. Not kindness. Dreaming is good, he added. But don't let it fool you into thinking you can stand where I stand. A few people nearby heard him and chuckled. Clara's smile faded, but she didn't say anything. Her fingers tightened around the notebook. Her eyes glistened for a moment. Not from anger, but from hurt. Leonard turned away. Already talking to another guest, Clara stood silently, her heart heavy yet strangely calm. She whispered to herself, maybe someday, he'll hear the truth in my music. As she walked out into the cool night air, The city lights flickered like stars. She could still hear the echoes of his piano in her mind, but she also heard something else, the quiet rhythm of her own heart. She smiled faintly, promising herself that this was not the end. This was just the beginning of her own melody, one the world would someday listen to. The next morning, the sun shone softly over the city, lighting up the posters that still carried Leonard Voss's name. His concert was the talk of the town. People called him a genius, a living legend. But far from the grand hall, in a small apartment above a bakery, Clara Bennett sat quietly by her window. Her old piano stood near her, a few notes of unfinished melody scattered on the floor. She hadn't slept much. Her mind replayed every moment from last night. The crowd, the music, and Leonard's mocking smile. She felt embarrassed, yet somewhere deep inside, she also felt something burning, not anger, but determination, she whispered to herself. He may have laughed, but he hasn't heard me play. Her hands brushed over the pages of her music notebook, the same one Leonard had refused to see. Each page was like a piece of her heart, her struggles, her love for her late mother, her quiet hopes. She opened the piano lid and began to play. Her fingers moved slowly at first, then faster. Every note told a story, the kind that came from a life of simplicity and emotion. Meanwhile, Leonard Voss woke up in his luxurious apartment. His phone buzzed with messages, invitations. Congratulations, reporters asking for interviews. He smirked as he read them, but his mind felt strangely heavy. He poured himself a cup of black coffee, trying to shake off the faint tune that kept echoing in his mind. It was something soft and unfamiliar, something he had heard last night but couldn't place. He frowned, not realizing that it was a small melody Clara had hummed when she spoke to him. As the day went on, Leonard met with his assistant, Evelyn, a calm woman in her late 20s who had worked with him for years. She handled his schedule, his media appearances, and sometimes his mood swings. "You were magnificent last night," she said while sorting through his fan mail. Leonard smiled. "Of course I was," he replied confidently. "Did you expect anything less?" Evelyn rolled her eyes playfully. "You know, not everyone you meet will be from your world, Leonard," she said. He looked up, slightly annoyed. "What do you mean?" he asked. Evelyn hesitated for a moment, then pulled something from her bag. "This," she said, placing Clara's notebook on the piano. "Someone must have left it backstage last night. Maybe one of your fans." Leonard recognized it instantly. The same notebook from the simple woman he had mocked. "Oh, that," he said dismissively. "It belongs to that. Cafe Dreamer, I suppose. Throw it away." Evelyn didn't move. Instead, she flipped it open, curious. The pages were filled with handwritten notes. No fancy symbols, no polished composition, but there was beauty. Something raw, something deeply human. She sat at the piano and tried to play a few lines. The melody was gentle and pure. It started simple but grew into something powerful. Leonard froze. The room seemed to change. The sound wasn't perfect, but it carried something he hadn't felt in years. Sincerity. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes shining. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said softly. Leonard frowned, pretending not to care. "It's childish," he muttered, but his voice didn't sound convincing. Evelyn closed the notebook carefully. "You can mock it if you like," she said, "but that woman, she has something you've lost." Leonard didn't reply, but that night, while everyone else slept, he found himself alone at his piano. His fingers hesitated, then began to play the same melody he had heard earlier. It was haunting, fragile, but it touched something deep inside him. He stopped suddenly, angry at himself. "Why am I thinking about her?" he whispered. He slammed the piano lid shut and walked away, but the tune followed him in the silence of his penthouse. A few days later, Clara was back at the cafe, wiping tables and serving customers with her gentle smile. Her co-workers liked her kindness, though few knew about her passion for music. One of them, an older woman named Rose, asked, "Clara, how was that concert you were so excited about?" Clara smiled faintly. "It was beautiful," she said softly, "but also strange." Rose laughed. "Did you meet him? That fancy pianist?" Clara nodded slowly. "I did, and he wasn't what I imagined." Rose shook her head. "Fame changes people," she said wisely. Clara looked down at her notebook resting on the counter. "Maybe," she whispered, "but music should never lose its heart." That evening, as the cafe closed, Clara stayed behind for a while. She walked to the small upright piano in the corner, the one no one touched anymore. She wiped the dust off the keys and began to play. The soft notes floated through the empty cafe, drifting out into the quiet street. A passerby stopped outside, listening for a moment. The sound was full of emotion, not fame, not perfection, just truth. Across the city, Leonard attended a dinner with other artists and sponsors. People laughed, wine flowed, and praise surrounded him like perfume. Yet he felt oddly distant. He smiled when people talked to him, but his mind wasn't there. Every time someone raised a toast, he heard that simple melody again. He tried to push it away, but it clung to him like a whisper from a forgotten dream. When he returned home late that night, he found himself sitting at his piano again. The city lights shimmered outside his window. He stared at the keys, his fingers trembling slightly. Then, without realizing, he began to play Clara's melody again. This time he didn't stop. The music filled the room, soft but alive. For the first time in years, Leonard felt something real. Not applause, not pride, but emotion. He sat there in the dim light, lost in the sound far away in her small apartment. Clara also sat by her window. She couldn't explain why, but she suddenly felt calm, as if the world had heard her without her speaking. She smiled to herself and whispered, "Someday, someone will understand." Little did she know, the man who once mocked her was already beginning to listen, and soon the world would too. The night had grown quiet, and the city lights flickered like fading stars. Leonard sat in front of his grand piano, his hands resting on the keys. He had played the same melody over and over, the one from Clara's old notebook. It haunted him, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. It carried something he had long forgotten. Heart. Every note felt like a whisper from a place he could no longer reach. He tried to convince himself it didn't matter, but deep inside it was already too late. The music had touched something inside him that fame never could. The next morning, Evelyn entered the music room quietly. She found Leonard asleep on the piano bench, the faint sound of unfinished melody still in the air. A single page from Clara's notebook lay open on the stand. Evelyn smiled faintly. "So the mighty Leonard finally listened," she whispered. She picked up the notebook and looked through it again. Every page was filled with messy handwriting, little hearts and soft pencil marks. It wasn't the work of a trained composer, but it was filled with emotion. She thought of Clara, that shy woman who had looked so small in that huge concert hall, and she felt something stir, admiration. Later that day, Evelyn walked into Leonard's office carrying the notebook. He was pretending to read the newspaper, but his eyes looked tired. "You should give this back," she said softly, placing the notebook on his desk. "It's not yours." Leonard didn't look up. "It's not worth returning," he muttered. "It's just simple scribbles," Evelyn sighed. "You don't mean that," she said. "You stayed up all night playing it." Leonard looked up sharply. "I was just studying it," he lied. Evelyn smiled knowingly. "Studying or feeling it?" she asked gently. For a long moment, Leonard said nothing. Then he finally sighed and leaned back in his chair. "It's strange," he admitted quietly. "The melody. It's incomplete, yet it stays with me." He tapped his chest lightly. "Right here." Evelyn smiled softly. "That's because it came from someone who plays with her soul, not her ego," she said. Leonard frowned but didn't argue. That afternoon, Evelyn decided to find Clara. She felt it was only fair to return the notebook. She searched through the ticket records and found a name, Clara Bennett. There was an address scribbled beside it, a small neighborhood near the train station. Evelyn took a cab there. The ride was short, but her thoughts were racing. When she reached Clara's building, she saw a small bakery downstairs and the faint sound of a piano coming from above. She climbed the stairs quietly. Each note she heard carried warmth and sadness at the same time. When Clara opened the door, she was surprised to see a woman in formal clothes standing there with a kind smile. "Miss Bennett?" Evelyn asked. "Yes," Clara replied shyly, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm Evelyn." "Mr. Voss's assistant," Evelyn said, holding out the notebook. "I believe this belongs to you." Clara gasped softly. "Oh, I thought I'd lost it," she said. Taking it with trembling hands, Evelyn smiled. "You didn't lose it. It found the right person," she said warmly. They sat down together, and Evelyn listened as Clara played a few of her pieces. The small apartment filled with soft, pure sound. It wasn't professional, but it was beautiful, like a story told without words. When Clara finished, she looked embarrassed. I know it's not perfect, she said. I've never had training. Evelyn shook her head. Don't ever say that, she said. Perfection doesn't move people, emotion does. And you have that. Clara smiled faintly. You really think so? Evelyn nodded. I know so. Before leaving, Evelyn asked gently, would you ever consider playing for others again? Clara hesitated. I don't think anyone would want to listen, she said softly. People like Mr. Voss. They live in a world too far from mine. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. Maybe, she said, but sometimes even the brightest star forgets how to shine, until it sees a simpler light. Clara didn't fully understand what she meant, but her heart felt lighter. When Evelyn returned to Leonard's house, he was pacing near the piano. Did you find her? He asked quickly, pretending not to care too much. I did, Evelyn said, and she's exactly what you'd expect. Simple, humble, and gifted. Leonard scoffed. Gifted? He repeated. Evelyn smiled. You can keep pretending. But you already know it's true, she said. You've been humming her melody all morning. Leonard stopped, caught off guard. I have not, he said defensively. But Evelyn just laughed. You have, Leonard, she said, and you know why? Because deep down you recognize what real music feels like, even if your pride doesn't want to admit it. That night, Leonard sat alone again. The city outside glittered with lights, but inside it felt quiet. He opened his piano and placed Clara's melody in front of him. He began to play softly, and something unexpected happened. He started to add his own notes to hers, blending his skill with her sincerity. The sound that came out was breathtaking. It was like two hearts speaking to each other through music. When he finished, he sat still. Tears in his eyes, he hadn't cried in years, not since his mother passed. He looked at the old notebook again and whispered, maybe music isn't just about fame. He smiled faintly. Maybe it's about truth. He decided then that he would see Clara again. Not as a critic, but as a man who wanted to learn. Across the city, Clara was still awake, sitting by her window. The same moonlight that touched Leonard's piano now brushed her face. She looked at her notebook, tracing her fingers over the faded pages. Someday, she whispered, someone will truly hear my song. She didn't know that the man who once laughed at her was already hearing it, and his life was beginning to change note by note. Leonard Voss sat in his music room the next morning, the sun sliding through tall glass windows, painting golden lines across the floor. He hadn't slept much. Clara's melody had wrapped itself around his thoughts like a thread he couldn't untangle. Every time he tried to compose something new, her simple tune crept back in, soft but persistent. It was as if the music itself refused to be ignored. He poured himself another cup of black coffee and stared at the piano. His ego told him to forget it, to return to the grand, flawless style he was known for. But his heart whispered otherwise for the first time in years. Leonard felt unsure not of his talent, but of his purpose. When Evelyn entered the room, she found him staring at the keys, lost in thought. You're still thinking about her, aren't you? She said gently. Leonard didn't answer right away. She's just an amateur, he said at last. Her music is childish, full of mistakes. Evelyn smiled knowingly. Mistakes that moved you, she said, and that's something your perfection hasn't done in years. Leonard shot her a sharp look. You're overreacting, he muttered. I'm fine. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. If you were fine, you wouldn't still be humming her melody. Leonard stood up abruptly, frustration flashing in his eyes. Enough, he said. I don't have time for this nonsense. I have a reputation to protect. He grabbed Clara's notebook from the piano and threw it onto the table. The sound of it hitting the wood was sharp. Let her play in cafes and small halls, he said coldly. The real world doesn't reward emotions. It rewards excellence. Evelyn watched him silently. And yet, she said softly, you haven't written a single original piece in months. Her words hit him harder than she expected. Leonard's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Later that day, Leonard attended a rehearsal with his orchestra. The musicians were tuning their instruments as he walked in, everyone standing up to greet him with respect. He gave a curt nod. Let's begin, he said. But as the violins began their part, Leonard felt something off. The sound was flawless, the timing exact, but it felt empty, like a painting without color. He frowned and stopped the orchestra. Again, he ordered. They repeated the piece. still perfect, still hollow. As the rehearsal ended, Leonard leaned against the piano. A strange ache forming in his chest. For the first time, he realized his own music felt lifeless. It had technique but no heartbeat, talent but no soul. He dismissed the thought quickly, convincing himself it was exhaustion, but deep down he knew better that evening. Evelyn came to his study. She placed a newspaper in front of him. "You might want to see this," she said. Leonard glanced at the page. It was an announcement for a small-town music competition. The prize was modest, but what caught his eye was a familiar name listed among the performers. "Clara Bennett. She's performing?" he asked quietly. Evelyn nodded. "This weekend," she said. "It's open to the public. Anyone can attend." Leonard hesitated. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to pretend he didn't care. But another part, the one he'd buried under pride, was curious. That night, unable to sleep, Leonard walked through the quiet streets of the city. His thoughts raced. He remembered Clara's timid smile, her trembling hands holding the notebook, and her voice saying, "Maybe you'll understand someday." He frowned, pulling his coat tighter around him. "Understand what?" he whispered to himself the next morning. He sat again at the piano, but this time he didn't play his own compositions. He opened Clara's notebook and began to play her melodies, letting them flow without trying to change them, without realizing it. He started to add soft harmonies, and not to correct her, but to join her. The music that filled the room was unlike anything he'd played before. It was tender, human, real. Evelyn stood quietly by the door watching him. When he finally stopped, she smiled. "Now that," she said softly. "That's music." Leonard looked at her, the tension in his face softening. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Maybe she has something I don't." But just as quickly, his pride returned. He stood up, shaking his head. "No," he muttered. "It's just temporary curiosity." "I'm wasting time," Evelyn sighed. "Leonard, you don't need to compete with her," she said. "You need to listen to her." But he turned away. "I don't listen to amateurs," he said firmly. That same afternoon, Leonard was invited to a private interview for a magazine. The interviewer asked, "Mr. Voss, many call you a genius of the piano world. What do you think of new, rising musicians trying to enter your field?" Leonard smiled coolly. "They try," he said. "But greatness isn't born from emotion or dreams. It's built on years of discipline. A simple melody doesn't make someone an artist." The interviewer nodded, writing down every word. Leonard didn't realize that his quote would later spread across the local newspapers, and that Clara would see it. When Clara read the article the next morning, she felt a small sting in her heart. She knew he was talking about her, but instead of anger, she felt a quiet sadness. She closed the paper and whispered, "He still doesn't understand." Then she sat at her piano and began to play. Her fingers moved with grace and pain. Every note she played that day carried both sorrow and strength. Back in his apartment, Leonard tried to compose again, but his hands froze. The words he'd said to the journalist echoed in his mind. A simple melody doesn't make someone an artist. Yet the sound of Clara's song kept returning, pure and unstoppable. He slammed the keys in frustration. The notes echoed through the empty room, reminding him of how hollow his world had become. That night, Leonard poured himself a glass of wine and stared at the skyline. "Why does her music follow me?" he whispered. "Why can't I escape it?" He didn't know that his arrogance was beginning to crack. And through that crack, light was slowly entering. The same light that came from a simple woman's heart. A heart that played not for fame, but for truth far away. Clara looked out of her window at the same moon. Her hands still rested on the piano keys. She smiled softly, unaware that her quiet melodies were already changing the heart of the man who once mocked her, and that destiny was preparing to bring them face to face once again. But this time on equal ground. The morning sky over the small town was painted in soft shades of pink and gold. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers and rain-soaked earth. The town's old community hall stood quietly at the edge of the park, decorated with banners that read Annual Music and Art Festival. Inside, volunteers moved busily, arranging chairs and tuning instruments. The air was filled with nervous laughter, excitement, and dreams. Among the performers sat Clara Bennett, dressed simply in a white blouse and a long navy skirt. Her hands rested on her lap, trembling slightly. She had signed up for the competition weeks ago, mostly to push herself, not to win. Her heart told her this was her chance to share her music with strangers, to let her story breathe through the piano. Her old notebook sat beside her, its corners worn, its pages marked by time. Yet to her it was priceless. It held every note of her life. As she waited, she looked around at the other performers. Most were young students dressed sharply, their families cheering from the seats. Clara felt small beside them, like a shadow in a room full of light still. She took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "I'm not here to impress, I'm here to express." Across the town, Leonard Voss stepped out of a black car. His presence turned heads instantly. He had been invited as a guest judge for the festival, not because he needed to, but because the organizers believed his fame would bring prestige. He wore a gray suit, his expression calm but distant. Though he looked composed, something inside him felt unsettled. Evelyn walked beside him, carrying her clipboard. "You don't have to stay for the whole event," she reminded him gently. "Just the final performances." Leonard nodded, but his eyes drifted toward the stage area. When the festival began, laughter and chatter filled the hall. The first few performances were cheerful, children playing violins, choirs singing folk songs. Leonard clapped politely, his mind half elsewhere. But as the announcer stepped up to the microphone and said, "Next performer, Miss Clara Bennett," something inside him froze. He didn't move, not even when Evelyn looked at him in surprise. Clara walked slowly to the stage. Her steps soft but steady. The hall grew quiet. People noticed her simplicity, the way she didn't carry herself like a trained musician. Yet when she sat at the old upright piano, something in her stillness drew them in. She placed her hands gently on the keys and closed her eyes. The first note she played was soft, fragile, like a whisper. The audience leaned forward, listening. Then her melody began to unfold, one note after another. Each sound told a story of loneliness and hope, of heartbreak and healing. Her music painted pictures: a little girl practicing on a broken piano, a woman dreaming despite the world's laughter. The hall fell silent. No one moved, not even Leonard. He sat frozen in his chair, his heartbeat matching the rhythm of her song. He recognized the melody. It was hers, the same one from the notebook, but now it was alive, richer, deeper. Her fingers moved with grace, not from training but from truth. Every note hit something inside him that words could never reach. When the final chord faded, there was a stillness so heavy it felt sacred. Then the crowd erupted into applause. People stood to their feet, cheering. Some even had tears in their eyes. Clara looked overwhelmed. She smiled shyly, bowing her head. Her eyes searched the crowd. And for a brief second, they met his. Leonard's breath caught. He didn't know what to feel, shame, admiration, awe, all mixed inside him. Evelyn leaned closer and whispered, "Now do you see what I meant?" He didn't answer. His throat felt dry. The very woman he had once mocked was standing on that stage, winning not with fame but with feeling. After the event ended, Clara sat backstage, holding her notebook tightly. She wasn't thinking about trophies or scores, she just felt grateful. Her eyes sparkled as she whispered, "Mama, I did it," remembering the mother who once told her that her music would touch hearts someday. A shadow appeared in the doorway. "Miss Bennett," a familiar voice said. Clara turned around, her heart skipping. Leonard Voss stood there, still in his elegant suit, but with eyes that looked softer than before. She stood up quickly, unsure what to say. He smiled faintly. "You played beautifully," he said quietly. "I didn't expect to see you here." Clara's hands tightened around her notebook. "I didn't expect you to be here either," she replied gently. Leonard took a step closer. "Your music, it's remarkable," he said. "It's not polished, but it's real." Clara smiled sadly. "That's because it wasn't made for perfection," she said. "It was made for people." He nodded slowly, his pride melting with every word. "You know," he said softly, "I once thought music was about control. But listening to you, I realized it's about letting go." Evelyn appeared quietly in the background, smiling at the sight of them. "Mr. Voss," she said softly, "the press is waiting." He turned to her, then looked back at Clara. "Maybe they can wait a bit," he said. "I'd rather listen a little longer." Clara blushed slightly. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Then don't say anything," Leonard replied gently. "Just play again." She hesitated, then nodded, sitting down once more. She began to play another tune, softer this time. Leonard stood beside the piano, listening in silence. Her music filled the small backstage room, simple yet breathtaking for the first time in years. He didn't feel like a master or a critic, just a man rediscovering why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. When she finished, there were no words between them. Just quiet understanding. Clara smiled and said softly, "Music doesn't belong to the rich or the famous. It belongs to whoever feels it." Leonard nodded, his eyes warm. "And you," he said sincerely. "You reminded me how to feel again." As he walked out of the hall later, the evening sun painted the world in gold. The crowd still talked about the mysterious woman whose song had moved everyone to tears. Leonard didn't say a word, but his heart whispered one thing over and over. Her music was more than sound, it was truth, and for the first time, the great Leonard Voss felt humbled, not by failure but by beauty, a beauty that came from a simple woman with a piano and a soul that spoke louder than applause. The night after the festival, Leonard Voss sat alone in his study. The city outside his window shimmered with lights, but his thoughts were somewhere else. He could still hear Clara's music echoing in his mind, soft, haunting, unforgettable. No matter how many times he tried to distract himself, the melody returned, wrapping around him like a memory that refused to fade. He had spent his whole life chasing perfection, flawless notes, perfect timing, technical mastery, but now, after hearing Clara play, all those things suddenly felt meaningless. Her music wasn't perfect, yet it was alive. Every note she played carried something his own music had long lost: emotion, humanity, truth. He poured himself a glass of wine and stared at his reflection in the window. "When did I stop feeling?" he whispered. "When did I trade passion for pride?" His own question hung in the air, unanswered for the first time. Leonard felt small, not because of failure, but because of realization. The next morning, he arrived at his rehearsal late. His orchestra was already waiting, musicians sitting in neat rows. They greeted him politely, but he barely noticed. He sat down at the piano, fingers hovering above the keys. "Today, we'll play something different," he said. The conductor looked confused. "Sir, which piece?" Leonard smiled faintly. "Something new." He began to play Clara's melody, gentle and full of warmth. The orchestra followed hesitantly, their polished instruments now blending with a tune unlike any they had practiced before. As they played, something changed. The music felt real, not rehearsed or mechanical. Some musicians even closed their eyes, moved by the unexpected tenderness. When the final note faded, the room was silent. No one spoke for several seconds. Then one of the violinists whispered, "That was beautiful." Leonard sat quietly, his hand still resting on the keys. He could feel his heart pounding. It wasn't pride this time. It was gratitude. For the first time in years, he had played not for applause, but for connection. Evelyn, standing in the corner, smiled softly. "You see," she said gently, "you didn't lose your gift. You just needed to remember why it mattered." Later that evening, Leonard stood on his balcony, the cool wind brushing against his face. He thought of Clara again, her nervous smile, her trembling hands, her soft voice saying, "Music doesn't care about fame, it only cares about truth." He realized how deeply her words had struck him. It wasn't her playing that humbled him. It was her honesty. The next day he called Evelyn into his office. "I want to find her," he said simply. Evelyn looked up, surprised. "Clara?" she asked. Leonard nodded. "Yes, I owe her an apology, and maybe something more?" Evelyn smiled knowingly. "You've changed," she said. Leonard chuckled softly. "Maybe for the first time in my life, I'm starting to." 2 days later, Leonard arrived at the small cafe where Clara worked. The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered. The smell of coffee and baked bread filled the air. Clara stood behind the counter wiping a cup. She looked up and froze. Her eyes widened slightly. "Mr. Voss?" she said, her voice unsure. Leonard smiled gently. "Just Leonard, please." She blinked, surprised. "What are you doing here?" He took a step closer. "I came to apologize," he said. "For what I said, for how I treated you." Clara's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. "I thought talent was everything," he continued. "But now I know it's heart that makes music real. You reminded me of that." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The cafe was quiet except for the sound of rain tapping against the windows. Clara finally smiled softly. "I didn't mean to teach you anything," she said gently. "I just played what I felt." Leonard nodded. "That's exactly why it mattered," he said. They sat down at a small corner table, and Leonard asked her to tell him about her songs. She spoke shyly at first, then with growing warmth, about her mother, her small piano, and the nights when music was the only thing that kept her going. Leonard listened, really listened, not as a critic but as a student. Every word she spoke humbled him further. After a while, Leonard asked, "Would you consider working on a piece with me?" Clara looked surprised. "You mean together?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes. A duet, your melody, my accompaniment, two different worlds. One story." Clara hesitated, her heart pounding. "I don't know if I'm good enough," she said softly. Leonard smiled. "You're more than good enough." They began meeting every evening after her cafe shift, sitting side by side at her old piano. The first few sessions were awkward, Leonard correcting tempo, Clara getting nervous. But slowly, something magical happened. They began to blend. Their styles merged naturally, Leonard's precision giving structure to Clara's emotion, and her sincerity softening his formality. One night, as they played together, Leonard paused and looked at her. "Do you know what's strange?" he said quietly. "For the first time, I feel like I'm learning again." Clara smiled warmly. "That's what music does," she said. "It keeps teaching us no matter who we are." Weeks passed, and their duet took shape, a piece that told two stories meeting in harmony. When they finished the final draft, Leonard looked at her with admiration. "You've changed my music forever," he said sincerely. Clara shook her head. "No, you just remembered your heart." As they played the final version together, the small apartment filled with sound so powerful it brought tears to both their eyes. When the last note faded, neither spoke. They just sat there smiling quietly, knowing something beautiful had been born. Not from fame or pride, but from connection. That night as Leonard left, he turned back at the door and said softly, "Clara, your music reminded me who I was. Now let me show the world who you are." Clara watched him go, her eyes glistening. She didn't know where this journey would lead, but she felt something she hadn't felt in years, hope, and somewhere deep inside, Leonard Voss, the man who once believed perfection was everything, realized that true greatness wasn't in the applause. It was in the silence that followed a song. When hearts had been moved and souls had been changed, the day of the grand concert arrived. The air outside the opera hall shimmered with excitement. Reporters gathered near the entrance, flashes of cameras lighting up the marble steps. People whispered that tonight's performance would be unlike anything Leonard Voss had ever done. Some said he was introducing a mysterious new pianist. Others guessed it was a secret student. No one knew the truth, that the woman standing quietly backstage, hands trembling against her skirt, was the same simple woman he had once mocked. Clara Bennett stood behind the heavy red curtain, listening to the hum of the audience. Her heart pounded like a drum. She had never played in front of such a grand crowd before. The gold balconies glittered under chandeliers, the hall filled with men and women in elegant clothes. Her dress was simple, cream-colored with lace on the sleeves, but she carried herself with quiet grace. Leonard approached her, dressed in his classic black suit, but his eyes for once were soft, human. "Are you nervous?" he asked gently. Clara smiled faintly. "Terrified," she admitted. "But I'll be fine." Leonard nodded. "Good. Because the world needs to hear what you've created." She looked up at him. "Surprised what we created," she corrected. He smiled. "No, Clara, this is yours." The stage manager gave a signal, and Leonard turned to the curtain. "Ready?" he asked. Clara took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be," she whispered. The curtain began to rise and light flooded in. The crowd erupted in applause as Leonard Voss, the great pianist, stepped onto the stage. He bowed gracefully, but tonight his eyes didn't seek the spotlight. They searched for the woman who had changed everything. When Clara stepped out beside him, a quiet murmur ran through the audience. Some people tilted their heads, confused. They had expected a famous artist, not a modest woman with kind eyes and trembling hands. But Leonard didn't care. He guided her to the piano with a gentle nod. The duet they had written together, a dialogue between two souls, waited for its first breath. Leonard began the opening chords deep and controlled. Then Clara joined, her melody rising softly like dawn over still waters. The contrast between them was magical, his power meeting her tenderness, his discipline blending with her heart. The music spoke without words. It told a story of pride and humility, of arrogance meeting grace, of two hearts learning to understand one another. The audience listened in silence. Some leaned forward, their eyes shining. Others closed their eyes, feeling every note sink into their souls. In the middle of the piece, Leonard stopped for a moment, letting Clara take the lead. Her fingers trembled, but she continued, her sound pure and emotional. It was as if time had stopped, even the air seemed to listen. Leonard looked at her as she played, and in that moment, he felt something shift inside him. He realized that this feeling was what he had been missing all his life. Not the fame, not the perfection, but the connection, the truth. He thought back to the first night he met her, the cruel words he had thrown carelessly. Music isn't for dreamers in aprons, shame burned inside him, but also gratitude, when the final note faded. The silence in the hall was heavy and powerful. Then suddenly the audience erupted, people stood to their feet, clapping wildly. Some shouted, "Bravo!" Others simply wept. Leonard and Clara looked at each other. Both breathless, he took her hand and lifted it high. The crowd roared louder, but for Leonard, the moment wasn't about applause. He turned to her and said softly, "I'm sorry." "Clara," she blinked. "For what?" she asked. "For everything," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "For my arrogance, for mocking you, for thinking music belonged to people like me." She smiled gently. "You don't need to say that here," she whispered. He shook his head. "No, I do," he said, "because it was your truth that saved me." The hall grew quiet again as he continued speaking into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice echoing through the grand space. "Tonight, I am honored to share the stage with a woman whose heart reminded me what music truly means. Clara Bennett, a name I hope you'll never forget." The crowd cheered, some people wiping their eyes. Clara looked overwhelmed. She wasn't used to attention, but she smiled warmly, bowing to the audience. Leonard turned to her again. "Music doesn't care about fame," he said softly, repeating her own words. "It only cares about truth." Her eyes glistened. "You remembered," she said. He smiled. "I'll never forget." After the performance, the two of them stood together backstage, away from the cameras. The world outside buzzed with excitement, interviews, journalists and flashing lights. But inside, it was quiet, peaceful. Clara looked at him and said softly, "You didn't have to apologize in front of everyone." Leonard smiled. "I wanted to," he said, "because everyone needed to hear it, especially me." She laughed softly. "You really have changed." He chuckled. "I had a good teacher," he said. She tilted her head. "Teacher?" He nodded. "Yes, you taught me that music without humility is just noise." A moment of silence passed between them, filled with something gentle and unspoken. Then Leonard reached into his pocket and handed her a folded sheet of paper. "What's this?" she asked, unfolding it. It was a concert program. At the top, the title read, "A Dialogue Between Two Souls," performed by Leonard Voss and Clara Bennett. But under her name were the words composer, Clara Bennett. Her eyes widened. "Leonard, I can't," she began. But he interrupted softly. "You already did," he said. "The world should know this melody came from you, not me." Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "Thank you." He smiled gently. "No, Clara. Thank you." As the night ended, they walked out into the cool air. The crowd still gathered outside, cheering. Leonard looked at the sky and exhaled. For years, applause had been his goal, but tonight silence felt more beautiful. He turned to Clara and said, "You changed me." She smiled. "No, Leonard. You changed yourself." The moon shone above them, soft and silver. Their paths had once collided through pride and pain, but now they stood side by side. Not as rivals, not as teacher and student, but as two souls who had finally found harmony. And somewhere in the quiet distance, a piano seemed to whisper their song again. Not as a performance, but as a promise. That true music, like true forgiveness, never fades. A soft morning light streamed through the tall windows of the grand concert hall. The echoes of last night's applause still seemed to linger in the air. The stage stood empty now, silent but proud, as if it remembered the magic that had taken place there. Outside, the city was alive with headlines and whispers. Every newspaper carried the same story: Leonard Voss and the unknown pianist who stole the nation's heart. But in those headlines, the name Clara Bennett was no longer unknown. It shone like a rising star, a symbol of humility, courage, and truth. In a small cafe across town, Clara sat by the window, holding a cup of tea between her hands. Her fingers were still sore from the long performance, but her heart felt light. She watched the morning crowd pass by. Busy people hurrying to work, children laughing, an old man feeding pigeons near the corner. Everything felt beautifully ordinary. For years she had dreamed of being heard, and now that dream had come true. Not because she chased fame, but because she stayed true to herself. The bell above the cafe door chimed, and she looked up. Leonard Voss walked in, dressed casually for the first time, no tuxedo, no pride, just a calm smile. He approached her table and said softly, "I hope I'm not interrupting your piece." Clara smiled warmly. "Not at all," she said. "I was wondering when you'd show up." He laughed gently. "I needed a moment to remember how to breathe after last night." He sat across from her, placing a folded newspaper on the table. On the front page was a photo of them at the piano, her hands midair, his eyes on her with quiet admiration. The headline read, "A Dialogue Between Two Souls, a Concert That Changed Everything." Clara looked at it and shook her head. "It still doesn't feel real," she whispered. Leonard leaned back, his smile soft. "It's real," he said. "And it's only the beginning." They sat quietly for a while, watching the morning light paint gold patterns on the table. "You know," Leonard said after a moment, "I've been thinking." Clara raised an eyebrow. "That sounds dangerous," she teased. He chuckled. "Maybe. But hear me out." He pulled out a small notebook from his coat pocket. Her old notebook, the one with torn corners and faded pencil marks. "I kept this," he said, placing it gently in front of her. "It started all of this." Clara looked at it, her eyes softening. "I thought you returned it," she said. He nodded. "I did, but after the concert, I realized I wanted to keep a copy of it. A reminder." "A reminder of what?" she asked. "That greatness doesn't come from perfection," he said quietly. "It comes from sincerity," she smiled, tracing her fingers over the worn cover. "Funny," she said. "That notebook started with my mother's lullabies and ended with your music." Leonard's gaze softened. "And both made me human again," he said. His words hung between them, gentle and honest. A few days later, a charity foundation contacted them both, inviting them to perform again. Not in a grand hall this time, but in a small orphanage that taught children music. Clara's heart warmed instantly. "Let's do it," she said. Leonard agreed without hesitation. "It's time we share music with those who need it most." When they arrived at the orphanage, the children gathered around, their eyes wide with wonder. Some recognized Leonard, but most were drawn to Clara's warmth. She knelt beside the piano and smiled. "Who wants to learn how to make the piano talk?" she asked playfully. Dozens of little hands shot up. Leonard watched quietly, a small smile tugging at his lips. For years, he had performed for fame and critics, but now, watching those children laugh as Clara guided their fingers across the keys, he felt something deeper, joy. Later that afternoon, they performed their duet once more, this time surrounded by giggling children and soft clapping hands. The hall wasn't grand, the piano was slightly out of tune, and the audience was small, but it was the most beautiful performance of their lives. When they finished, the children cheered, shouting, "Encore!" Clara laughed, her eyes shining. Leonard turned to her and whispered, "You see? This is what music was meant for." She nodded. "To touch hearts, not chase applause." As the sun set outside, painting the sky in orange and pink, Clara and Leonard sat on the orphanage steps, watching the children run around the courtyard. "Do you ever miss your old life?" Clara asked softly. Leonard shook his head. "No," he said, "because that life wasn't living, it was performing. This..." He gestured toward the children laughing and the sound of music echoing faintly from inside. "This is living." Clara smiled. "You've really changed," she said. Leonard looked at her with a kind expression. "No, Clara, you changed me," he said sincerely. "Your truth tore down my walls, and now I play not to impress, but to feel." A quiet moment followed, filled with the gentle sound of evening wind and distant laughter. Clara turned to him and said softly, "Do you think people like us were meant to meet?" Leonard smiled faintly. "I don't believe in coincidences," he said, "only in melodies that were always meant to find harmony." As night fell, they returned to the hall one last time to collect their things. The piano sat there in the dim light, waiting. Leonard ran his fingers gently across the keys. "It's funny," he said. "For years this instrument was my stage, but now it feels more like my home." Clara smiled. Maybe because it's finally speaking your truth. Before leaving, Leonard turned to her and said, "I want to start something. A program to help musicians who can't afford training. I want you to lead it with me." Clara's eyes widened. "Me?" she asked. He nodded. Who better than someone who proved that talent lives in the heart, not the wallet? Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "I'd love to." Months later, their foundation, the True Harmony Project, became known for discovering hidden talents from all walks of life. Students who once couldn't afford lessons now played confidently. Inspired by Clara and Leonard's story, the world began to see them not just as musicians, but as symbols of compassion and redemption. Years later, when people spoke of Leonard Voss, they didn't just call him the greatest pianist, they called him the man who learned to listen. And when they spoke of Clara Bennett, they didn't call her the simple woman, they called her the heart of music. And on quiet evenings, in a little cafe where it all began, Clara would still play softly, the same melody that changed two lives forever.